to understanding and applying equitable cooperative learning. You will notice if you are in Module C at this time for the second marking period, we are now down to Learning Intention number 2. And during this time, you will glean understanding and gain understanding about the grounded research of and engage in cooperative learning practices that reflect equitable access, opportunities, supports, and outcomes. You certainly can follow along in your UbD module that has been assigned in your Google Classroom, and you will also have access to this portion of the module via the presentation link. So let's get started. So let's engage in some thunder thinking. So for a minute, I want you to think about your top 3 look-fors as students work together in groups. And as you think about your top 3, I want you to think about what you are really trying to assess and accomplish. We'll start the timer. So great. I hope that you had a great opportunity at this time just to really think and process about your top 3 look-fors as you're thinking about students working together in groups. Now, this is where everyone has the opportunity to really share out during our lightning round. So, since the timer has concluded, you will have the opportunity to either type in, if you're doing this work virtually with your teams in multiple areas of your building, or certainly with your facilitators in your room right now, you can place your responses on chart paper or on the board of one of your top 3 look-fors. Once all of your thoughts have been gathered, what you want to do is really look for and summarize some themes that have resonated with the team. If someone has the same idea, then make sure to type agree in the chat box if you're doing this work virtually, or put a check mark next to the idea if you all are in person. It's really recommended that based on the time, more than one lightning round, because we know that you have great ideas going on and happening right now that you can share out and that can take place at this time. This will be a good time right now for facilitators to pause this video so that you can move forward and engage in that lightning round share out. Welcome back. I hope that each of you have had a wonderful time with your respective teams engaging in that thunder thinking and that lightning round share out. So let's talk about those cooperative learning practices, and we can take some lessons learned from geese. Let's take a look at the video. Let's think about this for just a moment, and I hope you've had a chance to pay attention to the 5 lessons that geese demonstrate when working together in groups. So, as you work with your team now, of the 5 lessons to learn from geese, which have you seen your students engage in the most? And which of these have you seen students engage in the least? Because really the purpose of this exercise is to provide your team with a baseline for that reflect and connect questions that are soon to follow. If you are following along in today's module, you're going to have the opportunity to place your responses here in activity number 2, the lessons to learn from geese. Again, paying close attention to the 5 lessons that the geese demonstrate when working together. So again, what have you seen your students engage in most or the least? Again, to reiterate those 5 lessons from the video, number 1, unity is strength. Adherence to plan is number 2. Empowering others to lead. Number 4, empathy. And number 5, communication or communicating within the team. This will be a great opportunity at this time for facilitators to pause this video so that you'll have the opportunity to engage in some turn and talk discussion as indicated here by the icon. Welcome back, and I hope that you had a great conversation in regards to how you've seen your students work together and what they engage in the most and what they might engage in the least. So let's take the time now to engage in some conversations. So let's do a Reflect and Connect 1.0. So with your teammates or your thinking partner or groups, select one of the following questions as you would think from the lens of what you have identified as strengths and challenges for your students as they work in groups. The first question, as you have observed your students in cooperative learning settings, who do your students tend to collaborate with best? Or you can select, as you have observed your students in cooperative learning settings, who do your students choose to collaborate with the most? So take the time now, maybe 1 to 2 minutes with your thinking partner or group to discuss one of those 2 questions. Facilitators, this is a great time now to pause the video. Welcome back. Now let's take the learning that you've engaged in from one another from Reflect and Connect 1.0 and let's turn that thing into a 2.0. Now select one of the following questions as you think from the lens of the types of structures. So first you identified the strengths and challenges that your students have as they work in groups and the things that you've observed as they're in a cooperative learning setting. So let's take that a step farther now and let's talk about the types of structures that you put in place for students when they are engaged in cooperative learning groups. So does their decision to work with others in your class have to do with voice and agency or the structures that you have set up and why? Or are students choosing to work with others that have similar backgrounds or do you predetermine the groups? And why is that? So that's a deeper conversation, again, taking the connection from what you see as strengths and challenges for your students as they work in groups, and now making that real and relevant and authentic from your perspective about the types of structures that are in place. Facilitators, this will be a good time to pause the video so that thinking partners and groups can engage in this discussion. Welcome back. This is a great time, and I'm sure that you all have begun to see this as you're working together. I'm sure that there have been some themes that have bubbled to the surface during your discussion time. I'm also sure that these similarities tie together your responses from the Reflect and Connect 1.0 to 2.0. But it's often to be reminded that students' actions, inputs, and their outputs are highly contingent upon the structures and learning environment created and fostered by the teacher. So let's make some connections between modules A, B, and C. We talked about in Module A about how we're tying our strategic thinking to our theme and our understanding about our definition about every child, every day, whatever it takes, and eliminating the predictability of student performance outcomes based on multiple metrics that can get in the way, or barriers that can get in the way of student success, and really balancing that with access, opportunity, supports, and outcomes. And then we moved to performance assessments and talked about how that's grounded really in the work of access, opportunity, supports, and outcomes, because performance assessments and that discourse really allow students to have that academic identity, helps them to form that as they're working together. Social identity is developed, as well as the intellectual challenge that performance assessments bring, along with voice and agency. So now making that connection that performance assessments and cooperative, collaborative group work should be foundationally grounded by access, opportunity, supports, and outcomes that can afford students the opportunities to capitalize on their academic identities, social identities through intellectual challenge, voice, and agency. So what are some key features of equitable, collaborative, cooperative best practices? Well, student voice. When we ensure that all students are seen and heard in the classroom, that really makes for equitable and inclusive learning environments and makes them possible. Students won't participate if they feel or even have that perception that they're not seen or heard or validated. So it's encouraging and really able to truly make ways for students and finding ways for students that allow them to offer their input in different ways. So think about your classroom, using the chat box feature, using personal narratives, orally, writing, or even providing illustrations to really be able to allow them to engage in that student voice and be visible and viable in your classroom. Because not only are you providing feedback to students, but being vulnerable enough to accept their feedback and implement their ideas into your instruction or the ways in which they will learn best. This truly demonstrates that you have heard, you've listened, and you've understood. And what does it boil down to, everybody? Relationships. Building those bridges and relationship and rapport makes a true impact on where our students are. Next, another key feature of equitable collaborative practices and cooperative learning is student visibility. You can foster inclusion in the classroom just by the way it's set up. Remember, in our Reflect and Connect, we talked about the structures that are in place. Well, the physical structures, not only the community building that is set up, but the structures that are in place, the physical representation about being dynamic with your spacing also has a lot to do with student visibility. The class formation can send signals about authority and equitable engagement. So, for example, do you always stand in the front of the class to address rows of students? So you can consider setting up your classroom so that it emphasizes interaction, such as your group seating, but also consider where you position yourself. Sometimes standing in the very front of the classroom can send up a message of a wall or a barrier being built. Instead of coming into the classroom, migrating throughout the classroom, of course, using the appropriate social distancing. But really, interaction and moving amongst the students can really de-emphasize that teacher-student hierarchy and really stimulate more discussion and discourse. Because students really want to learn in environments where they are represented. Consider the books, the resources, and the examples that you give to students. Think for a moment, is this what you provide to students a reflection of themselves? So think about the structures that you put in place, building that community, leveraging social emotional learning as a lever for equity, and are students fully represented and can see themselves in the work that you provide on a daily basis and the discussions that you give and engage in? And are they affirmed and validated in your classroom? When you think about another key feature within student disability, think about the discourse that you engage in, allowing students, multiple students, not just the 2 or 3 that sit in the front or over to the side, but everyone engaged in the conversation, and thinking of multiple ways that students can do so. Lastly, thinking about student authority. That's where that voice and choice, that intellectual challenge, and that social identity come back into play by establishing and expecting inclusivity and mutual respect. Respect is so key in creating those features of equitable practices in a classroom. And in many ways, folks, that has to be taught. We cannot always expect that students will come to class having, no matter what age group, those particular manners we may be looking for or certain ways that to address one another. We have to, at any age of the spectrum, K through 12, still have to engage in teaching that. And that also incorporates having high expectations for all students. The expectation for any classroom should be high for students, and they can tell when they walk in the door. Students can achieve, in most cases, where the standard has been set. And to promote inclusivity and equitable access, opportunity, supports, and outcomes is truly to establish and expect mutual respect. And then encouraging students to share and make mistakes. However, name calling, personal attacks, and hostile interactions, you have to set the standard that will not be tolerated when it comes to student authority. If students disagree, they must respond to each other with respect. And again, that is taught. So again, mutual respect yields more open and productive conversations. So as you think about those 3 key features of equitable collaborative practices, cooperative learning, think about ways that you can encourage your students to engage in student voice, visibility, and authority. Think back to the visual representations that you see here. Student voice, sharing those ideas and getting those gears turning, building that collaboration and community through the spacing that you provide, allowing space physically, but also space for affirmation and validation of all students, and then establishing that student authority. So as you begin to reflect on this portion of today's learning intention, think with your team about ways that if it's one of these items that you could really hone in on, latch onto into your future work, or even something that you're currently doing to really enhance and refine, then you've really begun to set up those equitable best practices in your classroom. Thank you so much for your time and energy today.